Now, I have the job of introducing Dr. Seljak. I'm sure many of you are already quite familiar with him. He's a very interesting professor here at St. Jerome's, and you may be wondering, why is the co-director of this center insulting tonight's speaker in her presentation of him? And I just have to explain that for several years, Dr. Seljak was my doctoral supervisor. And I can assure you, he is Dr. Evil. You're looking at someone who knows. And for a number of years, I was also his teaching assistant in his course on evil. So for a period of time, I was actually the assistant to Dr. Evil. Dr. Evil's assistant. That's a great line on my CV. I'm really proud of that one. Between the two of us, Professor Evil and the evil assistant, the only thing that we were really missing was a laboratory with pickled brains in it. But I think by the end of term, we had a little bit of that going on too. So it all worked out in the end. So anyway, I'm sure you'll be tired of my evil jokes in the next several weeks. But I'm going to take advantage of it because I cannot resist this wonderful target. It's really a sweet change in my destiny. But to give you a little more information about the good Dr. Evil, David Seljak is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at St. Jerome's University in Waterloo. He is also the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo from 1998 to 2005. He served, as you may know, as director of the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experiences. Along with Paul Bramadat of the University of Victoria in British Columbia, he co-edited Religion and Ethnicity in Canada, that was 2005, and Christianity and Ethnicity in Canada, which came out in 2008. He's also the editor of a theological journal, The Ecumenist, a journal of theology, culture, and society, which is published by Novalis. And his latest projects have been a series of research reports for the Multiculturalism and Human Rights branch of the Department of Canadian Heritage on Religion and Multiculturalism in Canada, as well as ethnic, religious, and visible minority communities in Ontario. Please welcome our own Dr. Evil Seljak. Good evening. Thank you. I'm Joanne Benham-Rennick. I am the co-director of the center. You may have noticed from our slides here that Scott, who is normally here, is on sabbatical this year, starting January. So I will be with you for the next series of lectures, and I must say I am deeply, deeply impressed that you are here. And I will not attribute it to David Seljak being here tonight. I'm just assuming that you are excited about this new year, and you thought, I don't care about this cold, I'm just going to go out and have fun because I'm Canadian. I'm just assuming that. Yes. Oh, look at that, David, look at that. There's a crowd this is a good crowd. I like this. I want to welcome you back this year. I wish you a Happy New Year, and it's my pleasure to invite you back for this first in 3 of our mini-series on evil. And I will introduce David briefly in a moment, but first I would like to invite Phil Heinz up to tell us a little bit about Kairos Grand River, who are our co-sponsors for the evening. So Phil, if you are with us, come and say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Good evening. Kairos Grand River is delighted to be a contributing sponsor for this St. Jerome's University mini-course, Confronting Evil Today, with David Seljak. We've been talking about this for a long time and looking forward to it with a lot of anticipation. And I've been asked to say a brief word about Kairos, Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiatives. Kairos, in a way, is uniquely Canadian. It brings together 11 churches and religious organizations from across Canada to work faithfully as an ecumenical response to the call to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. Kairos deliberates on issues of common concern. It advocates a social change, and it partners with people of faith and goodwill for action in social transformation. We're excited, and some of you may know, that the very first national Kairos gathering will be held here at the University of Waterloo from June 17 to 20 this summer. And we, that is Kairos Grand River, formerly known for a long time as Challenge for Change, is now one of a network of community-based Kairos groups across Canada. Besides contributing to the sponsorship of this evening's lecture and the lectures for the next 2 weeks, Kairos Grand River has also sponsored, under the banner of the Re-Energize Time for a Carbon Sabbath campaign, the 100-mile dinner last October, which we thought was a wonderful success. And tonight we launch our current effort to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. We hope that you'll look at the materials for the Lenten carbon fast that are available in the foyer. And members of Kairos Grand River will also be and have been out there this evening. Please see the materials, talk to them, and know that these materials are already posted on the St. Jerome's website. Why not consider becoming a part of this Canadian ecumenical justice community? Thank you, and we're delighted to co-sponsor tonight.
Thank you, Joanne, for that warm and wonderful introduction, I think. It was always a pleasure working with Joanne, I'm sure you can imagine. But she has a small vengeance tonight to make up for much suffering that I imposed upon her in the last 4 years of her dissertation, in which she produced a remarkably good dissertation on religion in the Canadian military, and that'll soon be a book with the University of British Columbia Press. So thank you, Joanne, for that introduction, and thank you, Phil Heinz. I worked on this Challenge for Change committee and for many years with Phil and others who I see here tonight. And it was always a pleasure to work with such committed people, committed to the faith and justice perspective that will be, I guess, the background of my 3 talks on evil. Now, it is, I do get this, the professor, I got a phone call from a professor of sociology who said a student made a very good point about ideology in my class, but they did it in a way that was funny because they quoted David Seljak, professor of evil at St. Jerome's University. And I had to assure him that there were no practicums in my classroom, that it wasn't a how-to course. And then one time a student phoned me asking for an extension. I phoned them back, and I got her roommate. And, I said, is Sarah there? And just 1 minute, please. I hear in the background, Sarah, it's your evil professor. So... And I thought, oh, if you only knew. I do. I have to remember to turn off my cell phone. I actually have had that where I've been given a public talk and my own cell phone goes off, which is very embarrassing because I always take the call. Hi, how are you? No, not doing much. What? No. Anyway, so I think the large crowd is attributable to the fact that the posters mentioned that the hall would be heated. That and the economic crisis has left people with little money to do anything else other than attend a free lecture. I mean, the economic crisis is bad. I went to the bank the other day, and the little thing said insufficient funds, and I didn't know if it was me or the bank. It's true. I bought a toaster the other day. It came with a bank. I mean, so that's actually all I had on my notes. Okay. What we're going to do today is to look at evil a little bit differently, I hope. And we're going to look at it from the point of view of the sociological imagination. So what we're going to work with today is this is an introduction to 3 lectures. And so you don't, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings. You don't know what's going to happen until you've attended the third lecture, where I throw the ring of power into the fires of Mount Doom, metaphorically speaking. And but what we're basically doing, what we're looking forward to tonight's lecture, is how we look at evil through the sociological imagination. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're going to look at, first, the social construction of reality, how sociologists talk about human life, and what that unique perspective tells us about evil in the modern world. And so that's essentially the path we're going to follow. So traditional concepts, I was born in 1958, and I grew up in a kind of pre-Vatican II church, really, because my parish was about the last parish to adopt any of the Vatican II changes. And I grew up with a very traditional notion of sin. That is to say, sin that focused really on the individual, that the individual was the subject of sin, and we had the earmarks of sin, which were responsibility, knowledge, and intention. And if you didn't have the intention to sin, or you weren't morally responsible, you were too young, for example, these weren't really sins. Later on, of course, we were introduced to the cosmological dimension of sins, discussion of Satan and the fight against the angels, etc., etc. And throughout the Bible, of course, there's that communitarian notion of sin, that a nation can sin. People can sin. When Israel does the will of God, they are rewarded. When Israel falls away, they are punished. What we never talked about, which was only a concept really developed after World War II in the Christian churches, though it has its roots earlier, was the idea of social sin. And it is that which is going to be our topic in these three lectures. It was at the University of Toronto with studying under Roger Hutchinson at Victoria College and Gregory Baum, who was my thesis supervisor at St. Michael's College, that I was introduced to the idea of the social construction of reality. In Roger's course, the first book here was a religious studies course, and the first book we read was Peter Berger's little Introduction to Sociology, which apparently some professors still use in sociology courses today. And in it, I began to understand this concept of the social unconscious, that things happen in society that no one is aware of, that we learn things that we are unaware of the fact that we're actually learning them. One of those concepts is the concept of personal space. Right? If you've ever traveled abroad and you've gone to Latin America, for example, and you notice people stand very close to you, and people from North America get kind of nervous and they start moving back away from these people who then advance upon them because they want to show their friendship. And, you have these people doing a waltz around the room, one moving forward, the other moving back. And you don't learn Personal Space 101. You don't take a course in personal space, but sociologists notice that people in various societies develop a fairly consistent notion of personal space and when to violate those boundaries and when to respect those boundaries. Moreover, in society, we learn that we're constantly interacting with institutions and structures, and that those institutions and structures push us in a direction that we may not even want to go. And so, for example, we may want to think of ourselves as community-oriented people. We may want to think of ourselves as altruistic. But in fact, when we participate in certain institutions, they push us in one direction or another. Some institutions push us towards a communitarian ethos. Other institutions tend to reinforce our individualistic tendencies and even our asocial tendencies. And even without knowing it, participation in these institutions teaches us things that we're not aware of. So, for example, I tell my students that participating in a liberal education is in a way an indoctrination or a socialization, more accurately, into an individualistic mindset. At the University of Waterloo, we accept students in based on their marks, on their personal achievements in high school. We don't look at their race, we don't look at their class, we don't look at their family background. And so they learn, it's me. I do the work, I get the reward. It's all about me. If in fact they were allowed into university based on their family, they would have a much stronger we consciousness, a much stronger family consciousness. If my future is tied to my family status, then family is what is important. Community, tribe, that's what's important, and not so much me. So participation in a particular institution can create in us, or at least influence us to accept certain ideas, attitudes, and values. And so sociologists talk about the social construction of the world. That's not to say that the planet Earth is created by sociologists. It's rather to say that we live in a world, or we operate in the world not according to how the world is, but how we conceive it to be. So if we believe truly that African Americans are inferior, or blacks are inferior to whites, we will act in the world as if that was true. We will create laws that will segregate them. We will discriminate against them. We won't worry about it if they suffer economic deprivation. That won't bother us, because we'll live in a world as if that were fact. If we grew up in apartheid South Africa, most of us would really believe that blacks are inferior to whites, and that really we should be in charge of society because they're not quite fit to govern themselves, etc., etc. So Peter Berger talks about, and this is Sociology 101, how the fact that we're born into a culture, we're taught certain ideas, we accept certain values, and then we go out into the world and we find out we live in a society that makes those ideas and values seem plausible to us. He called them plausibility structures. So, for example, if I were to be born in apartheid South Africa and I were to be told by my parents, by my aunts and uncles, by my friends, by my teachers, that blacks are inferior to whites, then I would go out into society and I would see that the high-status people are white. The people with the big houses, the people with the wealth, the people with the power, the prime minister, the judges, the newspaper editors, the teachers, the professors, the doctors, they're all white. And I would look at the servants, and I would notice that they're all black. And I would be socialized into a world where apartheid made sense to me. In fact, it would seem normal and natural. And I would believe that opponents of apartheid want to bring in disorder into an orderly universe. I would call opponents of apartheid evil, in fact. So this is the basics of sociology that teaches us something new about evil. Oh, did I just do that? Thank you. Oh, wonderful. If you want real evil, I mean, we all know Microsoft is the true source of evil in the world. And I quote the Bible, right? When Jesus turns to Peter and he says, "Thou art Peter, my rock, right? And I shall build upon you, I shall build the church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," right? The gates of hell. I don't think that was a coincidence. So, all right. So this next slide is brilliant. It basically shows my whole argument, but we'll skip it. Oh, thank goodness. Essentially, basically what I'm trying to argue is if you're taught a certain culture by the people you love and trust and know, right? You go out into the world and you see these structures, you live a life, you have a visceral experience that tells you that these ideas are true, right? And I just want to emphasize how visceral, how deep this is in the psyche, in the body of the person. So that when somebody violates your personal space, you don't think, oh, this person obviously comes from a different culture, and their idea of personal space is different from mine, and therefore I should be tolerant about this. No, you think, ooh, what does this person want, right? The hairs on the back of your neck involuntarily stand on end. And you think, is this person going to touch me? Are they going to do something to me? You're wondering what they want, right? So it's that kind of socialization that it becomes second nature to us. Very often academics say that culture is second nature to us. It's so close to us, it may as well be genetic. It may as well be bred into us. So we live in these worlds and we act in the world according to our conception of it. It's a very a deep kind of embedding of, or it's a social construction of the world, and this is how we live. And so this takes us to the notion, another notion of sin, that was very different from the one that I grew up in. It's very different. The markers of intention, knowledge, and responsibility are absent here. Because the child who grows up in apartheid South Africa doesn't think that when they later on grow up to be an adult, or they later on and grow up to be F.W. de Klerk or Botha, right? They don't think I'm doing evil, right? It's not like the Hollywood movies where, you know, they know they're evil. The bad guys know they're evil. They're even called Dr. Evil, right? And they laugh maniacally and they rub their hands, right? These people think they're good. These people think they're doing good. And so much of the evil of the 20th century has been done by people who think they're doing good. And so in social sin, the subject of sin is not the individual, but the collectivity. Right? It's the society that's twisted. It's the society that dehumanizes blacks in South Africa, apartheid South Africa. It's the society that dehumanizes women in a sexist society, right? The individuals doing this have no sense of guilt, not in the regular sense of the word anyway. They don't think they're doing wrong. They have no intention to do wrong, so they don't feel particularly guilty. Instead, we would say that they have engaged in a false consciousness, that they have their world, the world that has been socially constructed for them, has given them a false impression of the world, and therefore the motivations that they feel are not legitimate. And these, once they have this false consciousness, they make decisions to build institutions. They form a society. They mold their society based on that conception. They build in apartheid South Africa. They pass laws to segregate the races. They punish people. They put Nelson Mandela in jail for 27 years, right? All based out of this false idea or this false consciousness. So I studied with Gregory Baum, as I said, both at St. Michael's at the University of Toronto. I was a terrible student back then. I used to attend some of his lectures, but then I went to McGill and I was a better student by that point, and I attended all of the lectures. But I did get enough from him, and what I got was kind of inspired into this idea of the sociological imagination, that there were things happening out there in the world that we didn't really control. And we have to have a different understanding of ourselves. Malcolm Gladwell, in his new book, takes this idea forward, that we far too often emphasize individual initiative and individual action, and really we have to look at social forces and social developments. Anyway, Gregory Baum wrote a book in 1975 called Religion and Alienation, and it's just been published again by Novalis in 2006. And in it, he talks about 4 levels of social sin. And the first level is the actual sin, the part of the institutional, part of the institution that's actually doing damage to us. It's those dehumanizing trends that are built into every institution. It's that a part of every institution that isn't perfect, because only what God builds is perfect, not what humans build. And therefore, it takes away, it robs certain people of their humanity. I'm using apartheid South Africa because there's a nice, obvious example of humanity being, of a dehumanizing institution. The second level are those cultural trends. And by the way, I'm going to have these slides posted on the St. Jerome Center website, so you can download the whole PowerPoint presentation if you want. The cultural symbols, sometimes even religious symbols, that make that institutional framework or those social structures seem natural, seem good, seem normal. So in apartheid South Africa, for example, there were many discourses that legitimated apartheid. There was the anti-communist discourse. Nelson Mandela was a communist. They were going to take over. They were going to redistribute the wealth. South Africa was a Christian country, and therefore these atheistic communists had to be stopped. And so you see how the religious symbolism also acted to legitimate apartheid South Africa. The Afrikaners saw themselves as kind of a new Israel. They had been led out of the desert into this promised land. And the black people there were like the Canaanites who had to be shoved off the land so that the new promised land, the new chosen people could occupy that land. So the third level, he argues, is that false consciousness that's created by that interaction. I use those arrows a lot. It's that interaction between culture and structure. And we enter into that, and we enter into that world, which Baum refers to as false consciousness, a very useful sociological category that has fallen by the wayside recently. And from that consciousness, we make collective decisions. We make decisions about how to structure our society, how to define property, how to define power, how to define wealth, how to treat women, how to treat children, how to treat men. All of that comes from that world in which we live. And that world can be so dramatically different. You know, it wasn't so long ago, 100 years ago, where we truly believed that women were not all that suited for medical school or for law school, and that it was inappropriate for women to want to do that. And if a woman wanted to be a doctor, wanted to be a lawyer, perhaps there was something wrong with her. And today, the majority of students in law schools, most law schools and medical schools, are women. And we think it's wonderful and natural. Right? I mean, two different social outcomes come from two different worldviews. Right? So this is the way it begins. You have your society. You're born into a society. You don't get to choose what society you're born into or how it's structured. You're given a culture, really, by your parents or by the people you interact with, your school teachers. From a whole variety of ways, you learn your culture, and this situates you in a world. Now, it's not quite so simplistically stated, but I'm boiling it down to its basics here. And finally, we make decisions. So, if you wanted to use my drawing here and map it onto Gregory Baum's 4 levels of social sin, that's how you would do it, right? Baum starts with the structures and institutions, looks at how culture, religious symbols, cultural symbols legitimate those institutions and structures, how that surrounds us or creates a world for us, and out of that world we make these decisions. So let's look at world hunger as an example. I mean, there's always been the poor, there's always been hunger, but church teaching, Catholic church teaching anyway, on hunger was always stated in moral terms. The poor were hungry because the rich were not generous enough. The rich were too selfish, they didn't share. And so you had this moralizing discourse, this constant, be more generous, and give more to charity. And so the emphasis, of course, if the problem was selfishness, the solution was charity. However, from this new perspective, world hunger is analyzed not as a problem of individual people all collectively being selfish or individually being selfish, but rather as a systemic problem. I mean, the problem is enormous. Nearly 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day. Over 1 billion live on less than $1.25 US a day. It used to be $1 US a day, but with inflation and such. And I won't go over all of these statistics for you individually. Simply to say that we have, after many, many years of economic growth since the 1960s, when we thought we could tackle poverty worldwide, world poverty is, of course, still with us. Now, the latest statistics are very strange because we have these two kind of opposite ends where you have about 1.2 billion people who are suffering from malnutrition, the absence of micronutrients, not enough protein in their diet, and then you have 1.2 billion people around the world who are now obese and overweight. And so there's a lack of health on both ends of that spectrum, where obesity is now even moving into the developing world as a problem. Now, the issue then is not so much food production. We certainly can produce food on a grand scale. The issue is food distribution. And the food around the world today is distributed through this interlocking system of the nation state and the free market. This is the major way that food is delivered. And the issue then is really income, because people don't have the money to buy food. People used to grow their own food, but we've just passed, about 18 months ago, the UN has announced, just passed a special moment in history where for the first time ever, 50% of the population of the whole planet live in cities. Right? So this is a new moment. And so the emphasis on income is going to be greater and greater, because city dwellers are not like rural folk. City dwellers have to buy food. And so now the issue becomes income. And from that, then, you have to ask, how is income distributed systemically around the world today? And the answer is very poorly. This is a graph you've probably all seen, or many of you have seen. It's called the champagne glass graph. And what it is it takes world income and divides it into quintiles. So the first 20% of the population, the second 20, third 20, fourth, and fifth. And now this graph is a little bit of a distortion because it's organized by nations. So a group like Brazil might be in the third category, but the numbers for Brazil, it might be in the third quintile. However, that quintile would include the millionaires of Brazil as well as the very poor of Brazil. So if we took it by individual income, the top of that graph would be stretched out much further, and the bottom part of that graph would be much, much thinner. But even as it stands, the figures are shocking that in 1992, the richest fifth of the world's population received some 83% of the total world income, while at the bottom there you see the bottom quintiles earning between 1.4 and 2.3% of the world income. And in case you think things have surely improved in the last 16 years, in fact, they've gone in the opposite direction, where the top part of the graph has gotten broader and the bottom part of the graph has gotten thinner. In 1997, for instance, it showed that 225 of the wealthiest people, we could fit them in this room quite comfortably, had a combined wealth of over $1 trillion, equal to the annual income of the poorest 47% of the world's population. In other words, 2.5 billion people, which is says something about the craziness of the distribution of income in the world today. So the question then, of course, and now I find people don't debate this quite so fiercely ever since the economic meltdown, can the market solve the world food problem? Because, of course, there are many people in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other organizations who want to cure poverty. They want to feed poor people, and they want to do it with the old economic model of that standby of growing the economic pie. You have a larger pie. The poor can still have 1.6% of the gross income, but if you grow the income overall, their income can, if you double the size of pie, well, they get 1.6%, but they've got twice as much income. And that has been the model, and the slogan is, a rising tide lifts all boats. The argument against it is simply that the corporate structure simply cannot feed the poor because no matter how much extra money the people at the bottom get, the people at the top get even more, and therefore corporations have to follow what's known as effective demand. They have to maximize their profits. In the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that corporations must have only one purpose, and that is to maximize return on investments for shareholders. And so the responsible CEO of a corporation has to maximize return on investments. And so acting responsibly, in good faith, if the CEO of Cargill, which was once the world's largest food company, things have changed so much in the last 3 months, I'm nervous about saying that they still are, if he has surplus wheat to sell and he knows that people in one part of the world need it because they're starving, people in the other part of the world need it to feed to cattle so that they can have steaks, he will sell it to whoever is willing to pay the highest. The moral decision doesn't come into it because he has a responsibility to maximize investor return, right? Now, think if he didn't do that. Then he said, you know what, I am a moral person. I am going to send this money to these poor people here who are starving. These people don't need the fat in their diet anyway. Right? Less profit. Share price goes down, shareholders rebel, the board votes him off the board and replaces him with a right-thinking CEO, right? And why would they do that? Well, they would do that because, I have a pension plan here at the University of Waterloo. I have RRSPs, and I give my money to a fund manager who just watches numbers on a board go up and down. And when they go up, he wants to buy them when they're down, and he wants to sell them when they go up, right? And if those numbers go down, he sells them, right? And so I'm implicated in this, right? If Cargill goes down, my fund manager, he sells. And if he doesn't sell, you know what? I get a different fund manager, right? Now, everyone in that system is acting responsibly. I'm acting responsibly because I want to have some money when I retire. I don't want to be a financial burden to my children. I want to be an emotional burden to my children. I am so looking forward to that. I can't tell you. You never call, you never write. My mother's Slovenian, and Slovenian and Jewish mothers are the same. As this old joke about how many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, no, that's okay. You go out and have a good time. I'll just sit here in the dark. That's my mother. So I'm trying to be responsible. My fund manager is trying to be responsible. The CEO of Cargill is trying to be responsible. And everyone acting responsibly, everyone being good in this system, deprive the poor of food. And the Canadian bishops, in an important letter, have said, we'll always deprive people of food. And so if we only rely on market mechanisms to feed the poor, we are condemning them to death. And as Gandhi said, that hunger is the most widespread form of violence today. And so even good people like us participate unwillingly, unknowingly, in a system that condemns millions of people to a certain death. Aren't you glad you came out tonight? So, putting it back into our model, right? Because this is a mini course, I feel I have to give you content instead of just jokes, which is what I normally do in public talks. The free market and its institutional framework is the society into which I was born. I learned a certain culture, certain profound good values that sustain our society: liberty, choice, prosperity, freedom, individualism. These are the values that I've been socialized into. I enter into a worldview where if I choose one fund manager, that's good, another fund manager, that's bad, where I don't think about the consequences of my investment. I generally don't think about the consequences of my consumption. I go into a store, and there's 2 soccer balls, one expensive, one the same quality, $10 cheaper. I automatically reach for the better deal because I have been socialized into that value system. That is how I grew up. That is how I act for the most part. So we all, for the most part, good people, operate this way and make decisions to impose the free market upon societies around the world. So the people who are responsible for the globalization of the free market, they're not evil people. They're not rubbing their hands and enjoying their domination of the world. They are practical people, and they're trying to do good, at least as their worldview tells them about it. You should, if you've seen the movie or the documentary, The Corporation, once you incorporate this into your mind a little bit more, I just love that DVD because it shows you just how fundamentally people buy into this worldview, and people who are very good people respond in ways that are just awful. And there's that wonderful segment where you have a floor trader in the Toronto Stock Exchange talking about 9/11. I don't know if people have seen it. And he said he saw the human tragedy. He saw the buildings come down. He was horrified at the loss of life. And then he thought, what's happened to gold? Oh my God, gold must be going through the roof. Buy gold. And he said there wasn't a single person on the floor who wasn't thinking that same thought. You know? And the great thing about it, he was a nice guy. He was a good man. But he was, he'd been so completely in this institution that he at least saw that he was acting a bit like a crazy person. So the problem then with world hunger is simply that the problem is structural, not personal. Even generous people, there's a very wonderful segment in The Corporation where you meet the head of Shell Oil. And he turns out to be a dear old man. And these protesters go to his house and they hang a banner on his house that says murderers. And he goes out and he talks to them. And he and his wife come out, and they're good English people. And so they invite him to tea. And all these protesters and the head of Shell Oil sit down to tea on his front lawn. And they chat with him. And he turns out to be a dear old man, desperately concerned about the poor and about the environment. And then they roll the statistics about what Shell is doing in Nigeria and what it's doing to the environment. And you see that even good people act in this way. And there's another wonderful segment where there's a CEO who says, I thought when I got to this position of being a CEO over a major corporation, I'd finally have some power. And he says, I've never felt less free. Because his decisions have to be guided by one rule, and that is the maximization of profits. So, Scott Klein said, Dave, I can't be there tonight, but I'll tell you two things. Don't talk too long, and don't tell any inappropriate jokes. And I said, Scott, who did you hire? What were you thinking if you didn't want me to go on too long or tell bad jokes? So I will rush through this next part. That's the sociological imagination, what it has to do with sin. The second part is an argument that evil in the modern world is different, that we have a new type of society, and therefore the type of evil that we're going to be confronting is qualitatively, not just quantitatively different. That at a certain point, size turns into type. And there are two features I want to focus on in terms of the uniqueness of modernity is the idea of the revolutionary society and the role of ideology. And I love a sociologist named Robert Nisbet, and he has a wonderful discussion of the two revolutions that brought modern society into being. He talks about the Industrial Revolution, and we all know what that's about, steam engines, factories, but even beyond that, the incredible industrial capacity that we have now that has brought us so much prosperity and wealth and power. And the Democratic Revolution, the invitation of all of us into history through nationalism, where we're all meant to feel like citizens participating in this great project that is the nation state. And I also want to talk about, so when I talk about the revolutionary society, I'm talking about the attempt to restructure society, the entire society, according to some kind of abstract plan or an ideology, a blueprint. And I want to stress that this isn't just tinkering. This isn't just making the healthcare system more efficient. This has to do with a global change of the very structures of society, political, economic, social, and eventually it changes our psychology, sociologists would also argue. So it's really about you. And we've seen, sometimes we actually have revolutions. We have the American Revolution, right? It was an ideological revolution. We have the French Revolution, which was the world's most overtly ideological revolution up until that time. And the Soviet Revolution, revolutions in East Asia, China, Vietnam, etc., in which the aristocratic society, which was considered to be eternal, was considered to absolutely be eternal. If you talk to people today, you say, can you imagine a society without a market? And they say, no, the market will always be with us. Well, that's if you would have talked to a medieval and say, can you imagine a society without a king? They would have thought you were nuts. They just would have, without an aristocracy, they would have thought, no, human life is impossible without an aristocracy. And this is what is revolutionary about modern society. And ideology plugs into this. What is new in modern society is that people see societies as human-made, as socially constructed, if I were going to use that vocabulary. In other words, that societies weren't determined by the God. The shape of society, the hierarchical nature of society, is not shaped by God or by the universe or by the Tao, if I were to use the Chinese term, or by the Dharma, if I were going to use the Hindu term, that the shape of society comes from the activity and decisions of human beings. And that means that society, because it was made by human beings, can be changed. If it was made by, if society is a product of the Tao, you might try to change it, but you don't want to fight the Tao. The Tao always wins, right? You could, if you change Hindu society, you might try to undo the caste system, but the Dharma always wins. As they say, karma's a bitch. And you just don't want to do that. You end up in a very bad, you end up, reincarnated as a banana slug. It's very painful. I was so ticked off when that happened last time. So society is understood as a project, something that we can shape and do, right? And in fact, if we can change it, we have a moral obligation to change it, to eliminate cruelty, to eliminate suffering, to eliminate irrationality and injustice. That is what is new in modern society. All modern societies are revolutionary societies And we are living in a revolutionary society. That's what we don't understand. I tell my students when I teach this to my undergraduates, you think that it's like you're born on a moving ship, but you don't know that it's a moving ship because that's how you've been born and that's how you live, right? Or you think that you're swimming in a lake, but you're actually swimming in a fast-moving river. I mean, have people actually had that experience of swimming in a fast-moving river? And you know that if you ain't paddling upstream, you're moving downstream, right? And that's what our society is like. We're in a fast-moving river. We're being pushed downstream. But because we were born in that fast-moving river, we think it's a lake. We think that the water's not moving, that this is normal and natural. And we interact with each other as if what was around us was unimportant. So our society, Canadian society, Western European society, American society, is a revolutionary society. We're constantly replacing old forms with new forms. I mean, imagine the amount of change you've seen over the course of your lives. I know I don't usually say that to my students when I'm teaching them because their lives have been relatively brief, but people in this audience, well, maybe not so brief. I don't use the term old anymore. It's considered insulting. I use the politically correct term chronologically gifted. My children think that I'm in that category as well. So when I tell them to do something, they always say, "Was that how you did it when the dinosaurs were alive?" So. This is Joseph Schumpeter was a great defender of capitalism, and he wrote in 1942. He wrote a classic book called "Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy," and in it he talks about that the fact that capitalism can never be stationary; it always has to change. And the changes of the last few centuries, he argued, have not been because of wars, not because of revolutions. The great changes have been inspired by capitalism, by industrial change. This is the great motor of change in the modern world. Yes, countries industrialize under socialism. They don't need capitalism to industrialize. But those were all reactions, right? China industrialized under communism as a reaction to the presence of the Europeans, right? Russia industrialized under communism as a reaction to the constant pressure from Western Europe, right? So this is what is revolutionary about modern society. I should say this is the source of so much of the change in modern society. So if we live in these revolutionary societies, the blueprint for that revolution, how should we change society, comes from ideology. And we don't like to think of ourselves as inspired by an ideology or captives of an ideology. I don't know anybody who thinks that they have an ideology. It's kind of an irregularly conjugated concept, right? Where I just live by my ideas, you have fixed attitudes, and that person over there is an ideological nut, right? Is an ideologue. It's the more you disagree with a person, the more likely you are to see their position as ideological. But we all think in terms in fairly ideological terms. So when my students and you learn these ideologies and the values inherent in them in the same way that you learn about personal space. So when my students, who are all products of a liberal education, guess what? They all end up as liberals. And I ask them, why? I ask them, are you free? And they all think they're free. And I say, why are we free? And they say, well, we're free to do what we want. And I say, well, isn't it interesting? Everyone in the room here is free to do whatever they want. And everyone here thinks the same. And everyone here dresses the same. I ask them, how many people here are wearing 100% cotton pants? And that covers about 98% of the class, right? They're all free to wear whatever they want. And they all end up dressing the same. But that more importantly, they all have the same values. I say, okay, if you're all free to think whatever you want, how many people here want their parents to choose their marriage partner? guess how many of you people here have been voted to choose your your children's marriage partners. No one thinks like that. Well, that's because they're all good liberal individualists. They think they should do it themselves. So Solzhenitsyn said, this is what's new in modernity is the role of ideology in evil. And he says the difference between the dozens killed in Shakespeare's tragedies and the millions killed in Stalin's Gulag system was ideology. And Jose Casanova, reflecting on Eric Hobsbawm's concept of Europe's short century from 1914 to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, talks about how it is, here you have one of the most genocidal, violent, and bloody periods in human history. It's remarkable how we in the, quote, civilized West forget that, right? We talk about, those Islamic people, they're so violent. These crazy Muslims, they're so violent. Where have you seen Muslim countries in a slaughter as great as World War II with its 50 million dead, or World War I with its 20 million dead? Where have you seen the slaughter of Muslims as you saw in Russia under the Gulag system, where Stalin killed some 50 to 60 million people? Where do we see this? The great slaughter has occurred on the European continent. We're exercising a little bit of collective amnesia. And so basically, Jose Casanova is saying it's not the religious fanatics that we have to worry so much about. It's ideology, not religion, that's the problem in the 21st century, in the 20th century, and the 21st century. And so he looks at, look at the great famine in the Ukraine, where 5 million people were forced to starve to death. If you look at the great revolutions where you get the countless millions, the Cultural Revolution in China, all done without the help of religion. So Christopher Hitchens needs to, have another drink and kind of contemplate these ideas. And basically, this is the argument that there are new forms of evil that we hadn't seen. The concept of total war, where the whole of a society attacks the whole of another society, which we saw in World War II, which went all the way to the idea and the very close reality of all-out nuclear exchange during the 1980s. This is a new form of evil, and it comes from the Industrial and Democratic Revolution. It makes no sense to try to wipe out a whole population with nuclear bombs before modernity. Wars tended to be small professional armies who fought for a small period of time in an organized fashion. Non-combatants were irrelevant. Why would you want to kill all the peasants? Those are the people that are going to work the farms so that you can have their surplus production, so that you can tax them, so that you can be wealthy. You may as well kill all the fruit trees and kill all the cattle. So it'd be stupid to kill the peasants. But after the Democratic Revolution, where the peasants became workers in the industrial factories who were creating the tanks and the airplanes, and after the peasants became workers who were drafted in the army to become the soldiers, now all of a sudden it makes sense to attack the population, right? When the workers become voters who vote in the government, who goes to war, now it makes a sense to carpet bomb the cities to change the voters' minds, right? So total war is a modern phenomenon. Genocide. Stephen T. Katz, and I will be talking about him later on in the course, talks about how genocide, the idea of killing off an entire genus, a species, is what was unique about the Nazi program during the Second World War, the genocide of the Jews. The idea, a scientific program to delineate a certain part of the population as a human species or as a genus within a species and to eliminate that genus. That's what's new. And that kind of thinking required not only modern scientific thought, but a very highly effective and well-organized modern bureaucracy. I mean, after the Second World War, people looked at the Holocaust and they wondered what had happened. And the first thing they said is that the Germans had regressed back to a kind of tribalism. And on a moral level, perhaps that's true. But what that explanation hid was that this was a modern project, that Auschwitz was a modern bureaucracy, that there were architects hired and engineers hired. The fans that cleared the poison gas from the chambers had a patent on it because it was so effective and so efficient. I mean, efficiency was the rule of the day. What they wanted to do was, as efficiently as possible, move bodies into a room, gas them to death, clear the smoke, burn the bodies, so that they could fill the room in again, right? And there was this bizarre engineering feat or a competition to do this as effectively and efficiently as possible. Horrific evil, impossible without the democratic and industrial revolutions that define modernity. And so, in terms of the Kairos project on our carbon footprint and our carbon lent, and the ecological crisis is another example. That it's impossible. I mean, people say, what did the Buddha think about the ecological crisis? Well, the Buddha didn't think anything about the ecological crisis because in the time of Siddhartha Gautama, it was impossible to think that humans could wipe out nature. Nature was always trying to wipe out human beings, right? You had plagues, you had famine, you had floods, hurricanes, right? Humans were fragile. Humans couldn't wipe out nature. Well, now we actually have come to a point where humans can shape the world. Our powers are so great that we can actually change the climate. We are killing off species at a rate that is quite extraordinary. We are defining evolution for many species. This is not as part of our weakness. This comes out of our strength. That's one of the lessons about evil in the modern world, that much of the evil comes not from our weakness but from our strength. It was impossible for humans to shape the earth so greatly before, right? Now we have that power, we have that drive, we have that ambition. We have that worldview where we think the best thing we can do is to produce more goods, and we'll be happy when we consume more goods. And therefore, we march forward into the crisis that we seem to be more and more aware about and less able to deal with. That's what's astonishing, eh? I always said, why is it? We now know that it's happening. We now have better scientific information, and we just keep marching along. Right? And this brings us to very close to the last point, the ambiguity of modernity, right? That Gregory Baum used to have this symbol for his class. And it's not cowabunga dude. It's not surfer language. And it's about the ambiguity of modernity, right? That which makes us strong is also our greatest flaw. I mean, Shakespeare talked about it. The great Greek tragedians talked about it, right? Oedipus Rex, his great power was his ability to undo riddles, to push forward, to discover the truth, to keep going when other people had stopped. And that's how he became king of Thebes, and that's how he discovered the terrible secret about, sleeping with his mother, which would weird you out, right? It would. Let's give him that. That's, it's a Freudian slip, I think, is when you want to say when you want to use one word, but then you say your mother. The other great idea is that that the result of our action often doesn't have to do with our intent. That now that we're acting on such a grand scale, that our activities have consequences that we can't control. I mean, that's always true of human life, and that's also the theme of so many of the great Greek tragedies and stories. But we try to control things, and we have an ideology of control. That's the modern world. We have a blueprint to change society. We made society. We can change society. And it's that great faith in progress, in our ability to change society, which is actually pushing us down the road to greater destruction and risk and danger. So what we're going to do in the next 2 weeks is look at religious responses to evil. Evil defined in terms of social evil and in terms of the modern world. Now, the modern world has been a shock for religion. The earliest sociologists made this conclusion. They said, modernity poses a problem for religion, at least the way it's traditionally understood. And religious people have reacted to the modern world in a variety of ways. For some, they have embraced the modern world. They have transformed their religious outlook. They have become more individualistic. They've allowed their religion to become more rational. They've allowed more individual liberty in how people interpret doctrine. The Unitarian Universalists call themselves, the adherents of a liberal religion. And so Unitarianism is a form of religious consciousness that very much accepts modernity. There are other religious traditions that reject modernity and reject it very strongly. The Roman Catholic Church, for the first decades of the modern period, defined itself against the modern world. And in 1864, Pius IX wrote a syllabus called Quanta Cura. And at the end of this encyclical, not a syllabus, an encyclical, he attached a syllabus of errors, 80 errors that modern thinkers were making. And they included civil liberties, and they included religious liberty, and they included pluralism, democracy, basically anything we hold dear. So the Catholic Church just said a great no to modernity, and that was only overturned at the Second Vatican Council, which took place from 1962 to 1965. Right? So basically I've categorized the type of responses, and there's not one tradition that you're going to put in one category. These cut across all traditions. So the first is that there are religious people today who participate in these great evils. The Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, for example, until very recently blessed apartheid, legitimated it, produced religious symbols and texts that supported it. People felt they were being good Christians when they kept the races apart. And there were all kinds of passages in the Bible that they could proof text and use. Then there is the denial that the modern world is doing anything evil. It's simply ignoring evil in the modern world. And here you have people who simply accommodate themselves as best they can to the modern world. They don't think about it. They try not to participate in do anything wrong, but they have accommodated their religion and adapted it to modernity. And then you have the opposite, the people who reject modernity, but do so in a way that isolates themselves. The Amish and the Old Order here in Waterloo are excellent examples. But you have a wide variety of people. In France, they used to talk about the Catholic ghetto, where Catholics refused to have anything to do with the Republic, refused to have anything to do with modern politics, stuck to themselves. There was a kind of global rejection of modernity. American fundamentalism between the 1920s and the 1970s was growing and very strong, but it was off of people's radar screen because fundamentalists had isolated themselves from mainstream society, which they saw as ungodly, evil, and wicked, which it was, which is why it was so much fun. But anyway, I always thought. But another, and probably I think the lead in most Western societies, is compartmentalization. right? Where people now think there's my private life, and that's where religion belongs, and there are public issues, and on public issues, I have to be a free, rational, modern, secular thinker, right? And that's how many people deal with faith and justice issues. My faith is about my personal relationship to Jesus. It's about my church, my family, my community, perhaps my ethnic community. It has nothing to say about war. It has nothing to say about poverty and injustice. It has nothing to say about social class. These are two different categories. It has nothing to say about the ecological crisis. And this is the last slide I promised. The last group are those in which there's an engagement with modernity, a critical engagement. Religious people who think, yes, there's something to this society, and yet there is something that they're not happy with in this society. So they are looking at that society in terms of their own tradition. I mean, there are religious people who say, yes, I'm a Buddhist, but Buddhism is about my personal enlightenment. When I think about the ecological crisis, I'm an environmental scientist. I think in rational scientific terms. The Buddha had nothing to say about environmentalism. Those people I'm not so interested in. I'm sure they're lovely people. But the people I'm interested in are people like Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, we have an ecological crisis. I go back to the sources, the wells, the depths of my tradition, and I find wisdom, I find attitudes, values, practices, forms of community that I can bring forward in order to help us deal with this modern form of evil. And so that's what we're going to look at in the next lecture. We're going to look at people speaking from the Hindu, Mohandas Gandhi, Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, and the Christian, Martin Luther King Jr., who look at a modern problem and they go back to the depths of their tradition to find solutions to the unique forms of evil that we find in the modern world. Thank you.
Now, if you can look past all the bad jokes, you'll see why the students flock to this course for these amazing PowerPoint slides. Dr. Seljak would be happy to take your questions. So if you have some, there's a microphone on either side of the room. Please come to them on either side and keep your questions brief for us so that he will have an opportunity to respond before you have to go home to bed. It's cold out there. There's no rush. There's no rush. Just bring your questions up. Hurry or there will be more jokes.
It's always interesting to observe a moment of silence before the Q&A. It happens at every public event. So,
hi there. Can I be heard on this thing?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good-o. I was just wondering, given that Christ was quite harshly critical of the social institutions of his time, and he didn't seem to think it absolved them of the Pharisees and so on, the scribes, of their responsibility. How would this view absolve us of that responsibility if Christ was very concerned about the responsibility of his group as well?
Very, very good. Yes. That the question has to do with Christ's demand that we be responsible for our own actions and our own sins, and he demanded this of the Jews around him, his fellow Jews, and certainly it's required of us. And I do want to emphasize that this perspective in no way undoes the previous teaching on sin or the previous ideas of sin. That individual sin is alive and well today. I think we can all agree. And people are responsible for repenting as they have been called to repent for centuries and centuries. What's different here is that you understand personal sin in the context of social sin. There are certain social institutions and structures that can move us towards various types of sin. And, for example, participation in a market society with its emphasis on materialism, its emphasis on consumerism, its emphasis on status. Sociologists notice that, who's interested in fashion? If you've ever been to a small town, people generally dress the same, right? The big checkered shirts, the jeans, the construction boots, they're farmers, right? They're workers. Even outside of that group, people dress very similarly. City dwellers are interested in fashion. Why? Because in a small town, everyone knows who you are. You don't have to establish your status. Your status is fairly well fixed by your family, by your occupation, et cetera, et cetera. City dwellers don't know each other. We're anonymous to each other. So we're much more concerned about establishing our status one to another. And one way to do that is to dress, right? To dress well says something about me. To dress more informally than I'm dressed tonight would say another thing about me. If I dressed in jeans, I'd be expressing myself, right? So the market society does push us towards individualism. It pushes us towards materialism. It might make us a little more shallow. And those can lead to very interesting forms of sin. But it doesn't take away the fact that we're still responsible for our actions and still responsible for thinking about what we're doing. In fact, I would say this new conception of sin makes us more responsible and not less responsible. There's a good Catholic answer, isn't it? You don't want to get it, don't want to let anybody off the hook. But it makes us more responsible because now we know that, before we could think just by living the righteous life, we'd be fine. And that's what Jesus accuses the Pharisees, or at least some of them, because some of the Pharisees are quite clearly his friends, and some of the scribes of doing, of living personally righteous lives, following all the rules, feeling good about themselves, and yet they lay burdens upon the people. They do evil that they don't know about. Jesus accuses them of being blind, not selfish, blind. They don't know what they're doing. And Jesus is writing, very interestingly, that this perspective has allowed us to reread the Gospels, right? And we look at the story of Jesus not just as, the world's nicest guy who came and tried to teach goodness and was beaten to death for it, but we see Jesus in the context of empire, right? That Jesus was operating in a colonial system where you had the Roman Empire in charge, you had a Jewish elite, and the scribes and the Pharisees that Jesus condemns are part of that elite, right? And the Roman system was not to take over a place and squash their aristocracy. It was to have a kind of aloof colonial structure where the Romans would take over, allow the local aristocracy to keep the local population in control, right? And that's why Jesus was angry at the local aristocrats. He was angry at the Romans, and he was angry at the Jews who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. And hence he was crucified, which is a Roman punishment, a very common one. It wasn't, Pontius Pilate was said to have murdered 10,000 people in this fashion. So he was killed because he was a threat in some ways to the Romans.
I've got two questions. One, because you talk about modern society and modernism a lot, how do you incorporate postmodernism into this structure? The second question is more a clarification. Do you entirely see these evils as new? I'd hate to quote Martin Luther in St. Jerome's. That might be dangerous. But in his commentary on the Greater Catechism, he says that idolatry is the placement of anything that is good above God.
Yes.
And so I see a lot of that in this. I wanted to just get your comments on those.
Very good. No, Luther was a good Catholic priest for many, many years. So you can always talk about Luther at St. Jerome's. Many of the people who write in this tradition, and I'll be talking about this in the third lecture, like Gustavo Gutierrez, he takes this very definition as the root of modern evil, and he says the sin is idolatry. And in the Bible, idolatry is constantly, in the Hebrew Bible, idolatry is constantly the sin, right? It's the central sin. And the opposite of idolatry is not, the opposite of faith is not atheism. The opposite of faith is idolatry. And Gutierrez says that basically idolatry is taking what is made by human hands and understanding it as absolute rather than finite. And the way that we do evil is to take what is finite and make it absolute and believe it to be absolutely good. So I like the free market. I think it does certain things amazingly well, better than any human institution that has ever been created. It produces wealth. It disciplines people to be productive. But to believe that, therefore, it works here in Canada, therefore it works everywhere and for everyone, that's when we start to do evil. Right? To believe that what works for me in Waterloo will work for someone who has no food, no access to education, no access to health care, in a poor part of Africa, with a government that is completely dysfunctional. To imagine that what works for me will work for a person in that situation is to absolutize capitalism, to absolutize the free market system, to believe that it is everywhere for everyone good. And the African example is a good one. Stephen Lewis is leading a campaign along with other people. The Canadian government jumped in to have HIV and AIDS medication available at a cheaper price for people in Africa, where some 2 million people a year die of HIV and AIDS-related illnesses. And there are people who argue, no, this is terrible. This is a terrible idea, because those companies spent all the money on developing those drugs, and they didn't do it for the love of Africans. They didn't do it for the love of humanity. They did it because they were greedy. Greed is good. That was the chant that we heard for the last 2 decades. And therefore, if greed is good, because people who are purely greedy invested in this pharmaceutical company, and people who worked for that pharmaceutical company, just because they were purely greedy and wanted as much money as possible, developed these drugs to fight AIDS and HIV-related illnesses. And the corporation was selling that not to do anyone any good, but to maximize its profits. But out of all that, the invisible hand of the market arranged the creation of this new drug that we didn't have before. And if we take away from people the right to profit from their inventions, corporations will no longer create these new drugs. And therefore, millions more will die. So better that these 2 million people, 2 million Africans a year die, than for corporations to stop investing in new pharmaceutical research and development. And that is someone who, I believe, has absolutized the mechanism of the free market, who is willing to, and Gustavo Gutierrez even uses the term, he's willing to treat these Africans as human sacrifices to the idol of the market. In order for the idol to be served, because it's good everywhere and at all times, these humans have to be sacrificed. And so this is the way that we perform great evil, when our ideologies become for us more important than human life. And we mistake that the system, we create these systems, they're finite. They're not entirely good, because only God creates something that is entirely good. There's always a victim of every system that we create. And so we'll talk about this in the third lecture, that the goal is to look for the victims of every system. That Christians are called to look for the victims of every system. Jesus looked for the victims in his time, right? The poor, the marginalized, the lepers, the women. These were the people that Jesus hung out with. The prostitutes and tax collectors, right? He was a very disreputable fellow. These are the people, this is why he became not beloved among the leaders of society, but feared. And so this is what we have to do, is look for the victims in every system. Postmodernism is a concept that it's a term that people think describes something new. I'm not particularly enamored of the term. I think what we have is really, people call it late modernism or late capitalism. What we have is simply the acceleration of all the themes that the early sociologists picked out of the early period of modernity. More rationalization, a greater expansion of the market. I mean, it was Marx in the 1840s who predicted that capitalism would spread around the world. I mean, in 1840, capitalism was the minority system, right? It wasn't the powerful system, at least numerically around the world. But he predicted that it would fill every country. And he also predicted that it would fill every pocket of our lives, every nook and cranny, every niche in our lives would be infiltrated by capitalism. And so a lot of these themes that these social scientists picked up in the first few decades have developed. And so I like to think of the postmodern age as simply accelerated modernity. Yes, things have become more accelerated, but we have globalization of the free market, but we still have nation states. They're still essential. The globalization of the free market couldn't happen without nation states, without the armies of nation states enforcing it, right? We have an international system, but that means you have to have a national system upon which to build, for example. So in many ways, we're still living in the modern era, just the late modern era. Now, Professor Bonner's going to correct me on my sociology.
Okay, I think I'll go first here. So thank you, David, for emphasizing how important the discipline of sociology is and how it is really the discipline of the 20th century. I wanted to ask you a question about if your argument, which I appreciate, of course, as a sociologist, if your argument also has a danger of, in addressing the social sin and the large-scale sin, that it focuses on large structures and something, that evil is something that often happens in other places, by virtue of those social structures, and that yet implicit in your argument with regard to the idea that it's built into our consciousness and our culture, is that there's a sense of evil as sort of just not kind of being aware of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And is there, so I'd like to go back to somebody further than Martin Luther and to that devout pagan Socrates, that evil is maybe not thinking, not actually just thinking through what we take for granted in our everyday structures, and that it calls us to think about that both in the large scale, but also what's near and close to us, and that is the thrust of what you've been, one element of the thrust of what you've been talking about.
Right, very good, yes. I'm shocked that you would bring up Socrates, Kieran. Every conversation, it's Socrates. It's... Oh, my God, it's a one-note piano. We love our colleagues here. No, I think I'm going to agree with you. The sociological imagination, that line I took, is from a C. Wright Mills book of the same title. And basically what he says is the necessity, and this is a better answer to your question about personal responsibility. What we have to do now is we locate biography in society as that society moves through history. We can no longer write our biographies in a naive fashion. We tend to think of ourselves as, I started in 1958. That's when I was born. I went to this school. I did this. I chose that. That's how biography is written. Now, if I write my biography from a sociological imagination, I have to say, I was born in 1958 into an upper-middle-class family. My father was an engineer. My parents, even though poor, started to invest in real estate. I went to this kind of school. I had access to this kind of privileged high school, St. Michael's College School in Toronto and St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. I understand that I'm part of an immigrant family. My parents were Slovenian Canadians, so I was tortured both by my Catholic school, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. Does that sound Catholic enough for you? But also by the priests in my Slovenian language school, which was also very, very Catholic. Mary, Help of Christians. Mary's been a big thing in my life. And, so I understand. So if I'm going to understand myself, it's no longer, for me, and I would argue for anyone, it's no longer enough to understand ourselves in terms of biography alone. We have to understand ourselves in history, in a society, and to note where that society has been and where that's going to. And so I say to people, most important event in my life was World War II. I was born in 1958. But without World War II, my parents would have remained in Slovenia, one up in the mountains, the others down on the plains. They never would have met, and my life would have been impossible. So if we think of our lives in that terms, of the individual, now the biography in society, moving through history. So I don't think Socrates had a sociological imagination. I know Kieran will argue the point, but I think that this is what's new. And Karl Polanyi, in his book, The Great Transformation, he talks at the end of that book that this is what's new in history, the sociological imagination. He feels is such a step forward that in the Hebrew Bible and this is a small bit of exaggeration, but in the Hebrew Bible we became aware of the collective. In that by the time of Jesus we became aware of the individual and the individual choice and the demand to repent for individuals, right? He says now we have this new thing called the sociological imagination, which is just as important as those other two great steps forward. So, yes, I would say that this is what this teaching demands of us, to be aware, to understand that what our consumption, what our investment, what our decisions, what our and C. Wright Mills does this brilliantly in this little essay. He says you have to connect, the price of the eggs that you bought this morning to the price of oil, to the international, the international market system that set that price of oil. So the price of my eggs is tied to the salary of an oil worker in Saudi Arabia. Now I understand that I truly am connected to everyone in the world. And John Paul II preached, he said with the globalization of the free market economy, it has to be accompanied with a globalization of solidarity. So now the scope of my responsibility is greater, not less, now that I've become aware of social sin.
My comments will be on a much lower plane than the previous questioner. I don't come from academia. I've got a comment and then a question.
Sure.
I don't come from academia. I've been in that world you talked about, and I think you were too kind to CEOs and people in the financial world. I think one of the problems is that many people in the responsibility in companies or CEOs have lost their moral compass. And I speak from personal being involved in that kind of world. And I think the problem of personal responsibility and greed is everything, is something that is really part of the evil that we're in. My other question, which is just a thing that occurred to me as you were talking about, you used the apartheid example, but I was also thinking about the Catholic Church in its cultural reaction to the role of women in its, that this is. Would you comment on that? This may be that people see this as a good thing because this is the way it always has been. I just wondered. A minor comment on a minor topic.
No, I don't think so. When I was director of the center, I used to vet the questions beforehand to make sure that we didn't get troublemakers in the audience. But on the question of the moral compass, yes. I mean, individual greed and evil still exists. There's, but they've been around forever, right? But without the social sin, without the institutions and structures behind it, it can't have the consequences it has, right? I mean, without the Soviet Revolution, without the Soviet army, Stalin is just crazy, right? He's a personally destructive psychopath person. But given the social structures of the emerging nation state and the communist revolution, then he becomes a sociopath on a truly unimaginable scale. So the two are you can't separate one from the other. And in terms of losing their moral compass, I mean, sociologists would argue that that's what modernity does to people. What used to be solid ground evaporates into thin air. I'm stealing, right? People used to have a moral compass. We knew where we were going. Capitalism comes in and destroys that. Or modernity comes in and destroys that, whether it's socialist, whether it's capitalist, whatever form modernity comes in. That it takes what we thought was solid, rips it up, and throws everything into the air. And, we hear time after time that the only thing we can count on now is change. Well, people lose their moral compass when they're thrown into that kind of fast-moving river. And so part of losing your moral compass is not simply an individual failing, though in many cases there are individual failings. Bernie Madoff, for example, right? But in other cases, the needle on the compass is swinging wildly because what you thought was safe and sure all of a sudden is completely gone. And that's what is so difficult about getting our bearings in modern society. And that's why I love sociology, and why sociology for me has not been just part of my intellectual life, and it certainly has been, but it's been part of my faith life as well, because I get my bearings and I understand where I'm at using this imagination. So,
thank you, Professor. I'm a Canadian first, but I'm a son of Africa. So I have two questions. Maybe you may not find a solution to that, but I need the audience just to help, just giving it a thought. I have one general one. How can you reconcile the capitalist free market, as you exposed, of Westerners who are selling weapons to Africans to kill each other? There are many examples. There is Sudan. Actually, there is a war in the eastern DRC, where I come from. And how can you reconcile that? The providers, the corporations, Americans, Europeans, just the Westerners, giving to I'm not insulting them, our leaders. I'm quoting our leaders, African leaders, to kill their own people. And then on the other hand, the United Nations or the US, they say, we are condemning such wars. How can you reconcile? That is, I'm saying that is, it's absurd. It's okay to get profit as corporations, but to send those weapons, because we Africans, we are just animals, we can't know that this is a person, and then we kill each other, and then after say, we are condemning, and then the Security Council is there, but knowing exactly that they are the ones who are selling those weapons. It will take like 1 minute or 1 day to stop the genocide in Darfur. And I come from Rwanda. I witnessed the genocide. I'm a Rwandan. But as the Canadian General Dallaire said, because we were just poor people, because Westerners, they had no interest in that small country of Rwanda, they didn't come. Millions of people died. So how do we, so are you condemning we African people to whom to who you are giving arms to kill each other because they are not civilized, And then after that, we start laughing, or the media shoot television. It's absurd. I can't understand. That's one point. The second one is a special case. I want you to give it a thought. On one side, I'm happy you mentioned the case of apartheid. Now, in Zimbabwe, I'm not condoning what Robert Mugabe is doing in Zimbabwe. He's a despot. He's just undemocratic. He's a dictator. But since Zimbabwe got independence, the Britain promised that as soon as the independence was recovered, they were going to help the new administration to redistribute the land, because the land was in the hands of the minority white people. All we know history, Mugabe expropriated those land from the hands of those minority white people. And then those who promised to help redistribute that land, Britain, they are the ones who are now saying, you are a dictator because people are dying. The aftermath, they are criticizing him because of the aftermath of his decision. I'm saying I'm not condoning what he's doing, but I'm also not just giving thanks to the Britain as the colonial masters who knew that problem and who did not solve that. What is your thought on that? Those were my two questions. I'm sorry for my English accent, but still,
no, not at all. No, I mean, two very important and eloquently stated questions. Thank you for asking them. The first question is easy. Why do we sell the weapons? Because the goal of a corporation is to maximize its profits, and we sell the weapons and we get the money. We don't actually care what you do with them. If you would build them into schools, we'd be happy. If you ate them, we'd be happy. As long as you use them and buy new weapons, we'll be happy. So it's an economic system. The world's arms trade is insanity, quite clearly. Most death now, after World War II, the great deaths, the great kill-offs have not been two nations at war, France and Germany, Great Britain. It's been interstate conflict, intrastate conflict, and the great killer has not been the nuclear bomb or the tank or the aircraft. It's been small arms, right? Small arms is what's killing people. And they're distributed around the world by people who want the money. And, in that respect, the market is colorblind and really doesn't care and is morally blind in many respects. I'm sure if you ask individuals in these corporations, do they like what people do with the weapons, they would say no. But they would also say, this is how the system works. If I'm going to be good guy, right? If I'm going to be the good guy, if the Americans decide we're not going to sell arms, then they'll say that just means that the French can move in, or the Russians can move in, or the Chinese. And therefore, by the same logic of the market, they have to be there. They have to be there, or someone else will be there, get greater profits, and like good investors, we'll all move our money from company A to company B that pursues the maximization of profits. Racism is certainly a question in every African, in the Western reaction to any African conflict. I mean, in the Rwandan situation, it's absolutely scandalous. People have often seen the movie Hotel Rwanda. I think a much better movie is Shooting Dogs. I mean, Hotel Rwanda is a very good movie. But a better movie is Shooting Dogs. I don't know if people have seen it. It's it's more graphic, and it depicts the racism, I think, more accurately and fully. And so, yes, there's the issues always of economic self-interest, of racism, and the connection between racism and the history of colonialism. And so when we look at, the African conflict, are we going to see a bunch of individuals, each of them who is greedy, each of them who is power hungry, each of them who is violent? Or are we going to look at that individual's action in the context of a society that is moving through history? And all of a sudden, all kinds of interesting connections come up that we would have missed if we didn't use this kind of analysis. And as I'm going to argue, just on an intellectual level, you would want to make that kind of analysis, but also as Christians, as Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, people of goodwill, atheists, agnostics. People who have some kind of spiritual life, I think, are called to this not just intellectually but spiritually, are called to this through their faith. So thank you for your interesting and very poignant questions. I just wanted to, I dodged the question on women in the church. And the church loves this category of social sin. John Paul II writes it into his encyclicals. And there's this little blind spot where this kind of structural analysis doesn't quite penetrate into the church's teaching on the ordination of women or the status of women. And indeed, it's a blind spot and I would argue, it's ironic that John Paul II is the first pope to say that sexism is a sin, and yet does not see sexism in the Catholic Church as in a refusal to ordain women. So there was a last question here.
I just wanted to make a comment, just something a little bit more closer to home, where a corporation has maybe taken the social responsibility to benefit their pocket. And an example is, let's say, the grocery stores, Loblaws, where they're now looking to charge for the plastic bags because it is not environmentally friendly. And where you're saying we need to look and extend ourselves, my view was, what about the poor individuals that can't, the people that are in poverty, that don't have, even in our streets today, that don't have the money to purchase these plastic bags? I've been blessed, I can purchase the bags, but I know that when I go to a particular store, they have recycle bags. So the question that I would raise is, why is it that a corporation like Loblaws, instead of taking back and charging the consumer, using social responsibility because the garbage now, or the bags are now going into landfills and not disposable, why could they not instead create disposable plastic bags or biodegradable bags instead? So it just kind of brings it back home.
Sure.
This,
when it comes to green, you've got to look at structure and not just culture. And corporations can address the environmental crisis, but they can only do it in a way that is faithful to the bottom line of corporations, which is they must maximize profits. And so someplace like Schneider's can go through their factory and says, you know what? We're going to make a green revolution here. We use too much water. We use too much electricity. We're going to cut down on water waste. We're going to cut down on wasteful use of electricity. We're a green, responsible corporation. Isn't it interesting that those two changes save them a lot of money? Now, what about making a change that's going to cost you money? Now we have a problem, because that violates our raison d'etre, our structural raison d'etre, which, Kieran, is why I emphasize these large corporations and structures, and also it's just an intellectual habit I have. And so you violate the reason for the corporation, which is to maximize its profits. I have a funny story. My friend got into a car accident. And he had to get total write-off, but he was unhurt. His son was unhurt, so they were happy. And he's talking to his insurance claims adjuster. And he says, the car was, yes, it was 8 years old, but it only had 65,000 kilometers. It was in pristine condition. It was a great car. And she says, we're going to get you the right car, Paul. Don't worry, we're going to settle right. And he says, well, no, actually, you know what's going on here is your job is to pay me as little as you possibly can, and my job is to get as much as I can, right? And she said, no, we're a responsible insurance company. I treat my customers with respect. And Paul said, well, unless they've changed the rules about capitalism, the structure here is that you are trying to get, you are trying to pay out as little as possible. And I think, that's what you have to remember. And so, yes, the Loblaws is happy to go green when they're going to earn 5 cents for every plastic bag. They're happy to sell you permanent shopping bags at $1 each. Because I don't know about you, but most of my permanent bags, I don't know what happens to those things. I think those are the biodegradable shopping bags. They just disappear out of my house, and I feel green and guilty, and so I buy some more. And I think I've sent dozens of dollars to hundreds of dollars to Sobeys and Zehrs buying those bags. So any solution that doesn't violate the bottom line is fine with them. And if it actually adds to the bottom line, that's fine with them. But corporations cannot make changes that will hurt their profitability in the long run. They can do so in the short run, but in the long run they can't, because if they do, a competitor will come in, refuse to do that, right, and outcompete them, offer the products for a lower price. So it's a structural problem. It's not about the individual consciousness of the CEO. Yes, last one, really.
Well, I have a continuous comment/question. About the corporations, I guess, couldn't you say that the reason why a corporation needs profit is to reward its shareholders, and its shareholders are real people who do who do want to be rewarded and who do want to make a profit themselves, and yet they can have an effect on what the corporation does, yet I guess they choose not to. And at the same time, it kind of ties in with what you were saying about how if one corporation doesn't supply guns to like an African country, then another one will. And that seems a really common excuse for people as well as corporations, Well, yeah, I'll buy a hybrid car, but what's the point if only I buy a hybrid car? It's not going to make a difference.
Right. Yeah.
And my question is, I guess this all goes to what you were saying, how you realize how you buy some eggs and it connects to how much money a worker in Saudi Arabia gets. So there's this whole framework, all these interconnections that are pretty recent. The global economy that hasn't been in effect in, say, the 19th century, and yet the mentality of people in general, I guess, seems to be similar to the mentality in the 19th century and before, how you're concentrating on your country, your small community, not really on what's beyond, yet now you're affecting things that are beyond, and how America is affecting Africa, and Africa is affecting other places. So.
Thank you for that, for those observations. You're quite right. Good people. The corporate structure is such that companies are supposed to make profits for shareholders, and that's how we get the good things that we have in our life. That's how the clothes that I'm wearing are made, the house that I house my children in was made, et cetera, et cetera. That's all good. It's when you take something that is human-made and good and believe that it is absolutely good, refuse to question it, apply it everywhere, apply it inappropriately, that's when you start to do great evil. That's the ambiguity of modernity. This is something good. This is something that works, and it works for us. And yet, everything that's good has a shadow side, right? Leonard Cohen has that brilliant song. He says, "Forget about your perfect offering. Everything's got a crack," right? And that's how the light gets in. Everything that's made by human beings is flawed, and that flaw is what we have to focus on. not the good that's done. We have to focus on the victims. We have to focus on the flaw. And that's where the light is. That's where we find God. If it better be quick, because
just quickly.
these people want to go.
Bigger, better, newer is not always better. Mm-hmm. And when we it's the Peter principle. We get to the point where, like this was good, this should be better, and we get to the point where all of a sudden we start destroying the good.
Right.
There was a point in time when people would spend their lives trying to discover new medicines, new drugs, antibiotics and sulfur and whatever, trying to cure people and keep them alive, not make a fortune. They were discovering these things to keep people healthy and alive, and to keep children from dying before they were 5.
Yes, they've all been bought out.
But when we have corporations, when we have corporations,
yeah.
The corporations cannot exist without the people in this room telling them, I don't want a 5% return, I want a 9% return. And these people, not just these, society who buys into the corporation has to be responsible for what they invest in. If they don't want to invest in a corporation that sells arms, they have to do their homework. And if the arms dealers, or if the countries don't deal with arms because somebody else will, this is tantamount to drug dealers. Well, I don't use drugs, I just deal them.
All right.
So the people who invest in the corporations are actually a lot more powerful than the CEOs and the people running them. Mm-hmm. And they have to take responsibility. It's like telling your children, if you aren't part of the solution, you are part of the problem.
Okay, thank you. You know what? If you go to the Kairos table back there, that's the first step. This is really a wonderful ecumenical initiative where a lot of this research has been done. People feel lost, a little bit overwhelmed, but there are Christian organizations that have gone on before you. Go to the table, find out some of the answers to these last 2 questions. So I thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a good example tonight of how evil creeps into your life. It comes in innocuously, telling jokes about its mother-in-law, and then it makes itself at home, and it just stays. So I will have a stern talking to David, which he will completely ignore, and we will end much earlier next week, and you will have an opportunity for more questions then. But I must hand it to him, despite his cold, dark heart, he's not a bad speaker. So I hope you'll rejoin us next Friday and the one following. Next Friday's lecture is on studies in evil, and the one following that on the 30th is a response to evil. So thanks again. You're courageous people. Go back out in that cold, dark night knowing that there's more evil to follow.